Hey, good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. I wanted to share a little bit as we get started today from the book of Nehemiah. In my quiet time this morning, I read a lot through Nehemiah, and it was very intriguing to me the his response specifically to adversity when he was fulfilling those things in which God was calling him to do. So, for those who don't know the story of Nehemiah, after the fall of Jerusalem that was destroyed. They burnt the city. They destroyed the temple. Babylon came in and just wiped out the city. Took a lot of people into exile back into Babylon. And after 70 years, they began to come back. First Ezra and then Nehemiah came back. Ezra came back to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah came back to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, rebuild the walls and the city gates of Jerusalem. And so while during that time, he faced some opposition of people who were living in the land. So I want to read a little bit of Nehemiah chapter 6 to you, because his response to opposition and people who were trying to discourage him from the things God called him to do, I thought was very interesting. I wanted us to just highlight that this morning. So I'm reading from Nehemiah chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It said, "Now it came about," and it's going to be a little bit of verses. Just bear with me. If you got a Bible, grab your Bible, or you can just listen along with us. And it says, "Now it came about when it was reported to Sanballat or Tobiah the Geshem the Arab, and to the rest of our enemies, that I had rebuilt the wall, and that no breach remained in it, although at that time I had not set the doors and the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to me, saying, 'Come, let us meet together at that place in the plain of Ono.' But they were planning to harm me. So I sent messengers to them, saying, 'I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down to you. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?'" So if you keep reading, they send these letters 4 times, and every single time Nehemiah responds the exact same way. Then the story goes on, and they start making up stories and saying, "We're going to send a letter to the king telling him that you're trying to rebel, that you're creating a revolt in Jerusalem to make you stop." And Nehemiah's simple reply in verse 8 says, "Such things as you are saying have not been done, but you are inventing them in your own mind. Verse 9 says, "For all of them were trying to frighten us, thinking they will become discouraged with the work, and it will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hand." And the thing that it really was intriguing to me this morning is Nehemiah's response to that opposition. It is very natural for us when we face opposition, when people come against those things which we know that God's called us to do. You know what I mean? We're going to face opposition to that, whether it's obedience to God, living a life of morality in alignment with the Bible, whether it's pursuing a call that you feel like God is calling you to. Like in my life, I know that recently God has just put a deep desire in me to be an author, to write, and I know it's from God, and so I'm pursuing those things with passion. But I also know that when we pursue things with passion, the enemy will send, whether it's people or circumstances, situations, to try to discourage us and stop the work in which God has called us to do. And Nehemiah's response was one that really stuck out to me, because it's natural for us to push back against people who are standing in our way, or people who are coming against us. So when people start calling us out, or trying to discourage us, or trying to stop the work in which God has called us to do, it's very natural for us to try to push back and just, and push back in such a way that puts that person down or that situation down, or we're trying to frame it as we're the victim in the situation, or we're trying to, I have little kids at the house. When one of them does something wrong, or one of them doesn't like something else, it's always the other person's fault, right? And so it's natural for us to want to, when somebody tries to come against us, the first thing is try to point out something they're doing wrong, or trying to justify ourselves for why what we're doing is right, and why you're wrong, and all of those other things. Nehemiah, what was interesting is, he didn't sit here and just fight these things going, "No, well, you're just a terrible person. You're trying to stop the work of God," and blah, 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 blah. What did he say when these guys sent them the message that says, "Hey, let's come meet up in this area"? He said, I am doing a great work and cannot come down to you. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? He didn't try to bash them. He didn't try to tell them they were idiots. He didn't try to show them like, hey, you know what? You're absolutely wrong for doing this kind of thing. Now, later on, when they tried to create falsity and tried to create lies, he just said, hey, look, you're making this stuff up in your head. This is not even true. I'm not worried about it. And that's what was so amazing to be about Nehemiah, is he had such a confidence of, this is what God has told me to do. This is who God has called me to be, that he was not going to allow distractions. He was not going to allow discouragement to stop the work from being done in which God has called him to do. And sometimes I think in the church we get a little too wrapped up with callings of God. What is God calling you to do? What are those purpose? Like, what's your life's purpose? And coming from somebody who spent 30 years searching for that purpose and trying to figure it out, and never really in knowing, honestly, until recently, what I felt like God was calling me to do. Well, does that mean I spent 35 years in failure? No, I think God desires faithfulness from us in the moment, whatever it is. So it's not necessarily a calling. What's this great work that God's calling you to do? It's, are you being faithful in the moment? Are you living a life of purity in the moment? If God places something in front of you, are you being faithful to that? Are you being a good steward with that, with the finances that God has placed in your life? Are you being a good steward with it? Whatever he is calling you to, if it is from God, it is going against the rule of our enemy, Satan. And he will try to, as Pastor Mark always says, 3 ways the enemy has always tried to do it. He tries to destroy us, he tries to distract us, and he tries to discourage us. We see this in the book of Nehemiah. All 3 of those are present. And yet Nehemiah was so confident in his way and in his commitment to doing what God has laid on his heart to do, that all 3 of those things were just handled with confidence, without bashing the enemy, without just trying to just belittle them and try to, drag their name through mud. He just was confident, saying, no, I'm not going to go do that because I'm doing what God's called me to do. No, that's fine. Y'all do you can. The enemies tried to come against him. They said, you know what? We're going to set up. If you read it, it's an amazing story. All that they did to make sure that the city was protected against attack. It talks about, people were holding a weapon in one hand and building or moving around materials in the other. There was somebody working while somebody was standing on guard. They would, guard during the day, or they would work during the day and guard at night. Like, it's an amazing story to read. I encourage you to read it, especially if you know beyond a shadow of a doubt God is calling you to something, or there's something you're supposed to be doing or standing for. Nehemiah is a great story because it teaches us one of confidence, I love the word meekness, this idea of strength under control, strength under power. When you think of a lion, you don't think of just raw power, just destroying bull in the china shop, right? Just all over the place. You think of a honed, in control, unlimited power behind that. And so that's kind of the idea of meekness. And I tell you, that's who I want to be. You see that in the life of Christ so much. We don't talk enough about meekness, especially in men today. We need to be people who are meek, who know when to be gentle, who know when to ease things down, but have the power and strength under control, that when the situation happens, or we face temptation, or we face opposition, we don't pop a lid and just lose it. We have that confidence and that control to know who we are, to know what we're called to be, to know what we're called to do, to have that strength under control, to be people who are meek and continue on with who God has called us to be, with what God has called us to do, and continue to be faithful stewards with what God has put into our life. And so it was an amazing thing to me reading it this morning and just thinking through how natural it is to fight against opposition and try to push back against it. And yet Nehemiah just so confidently was a character of meekness, at least in the first half of the book. I know that the ending is interesting in how it ends. But in this portion, in his obedience to God, he was so meek in that moment of, I'm not going to stop what I'm doing but he also didn't take the opportunity to bash those other people and to bash his opposition. He recognized them, even this because he wrote this. He recognized who his enemies were, but he didn't just drag them through the mud, tell them how dare they try to get in our way. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm staying focused on the calling in which God has called me to do, being who God's called me to be, doing what he's called me to do, and I'm going to be faithful to that. I'm going to protect from the enemy's attacks, and he did that very strongly, but he stayed focused. He stayed dedicated to what it was, and that's just what I want to encourage you to do. If you know who God's called you to be, if you know what God's called you to do it. Stay focused on that. Don't get distracted defending yourself and feeling like you need to stand up and blah 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 and just show the world why what you're doing is right. Stay the course, stay meek, stay confident, but be gentle, be Christ-like, be loving, and stay focused. And do everything you can to stay obedient, to stay faithful, and to stay humble in the process, because it's not you. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about God, his kingdom, his glory. Our lives are just simply stewardship. So let's steward it well and be faithful in the process. God bless you guys. You have a great day. We'll talk to you soon.